The Monster Manual is a book that I hold near and dear to my heart, despite its flaws. I really do love it. When you spend the majority of your time playing Dungeons & Dragons as a dungeon master, it's hard not to have an affinity for this book. For me, it's what brings the game to life. It's the book that has the dragons. It's where most of the challenges in the game are actually born from. As a DM, it's always been my favorite to just look through, read the lore, and get inspired for an upcoming session, or even a new campaign. For me, it's a book that's always been a critical element to being able to run a great game. And that's why I was blown away when I found out that not all of the 2024 books for D&D are actually coming out in 2024. The Player's Handbook releases on September 17th of this year, the Dungeon Master's Guide on November 12th, but we won't be seeing the Monster Manual until February 18th, 2025. I didn't see that coming. I had fully expected that the team would abandon the staggered release approach of the past and instead opt for a box set release sometime between September and November of this year. But they didn't. They kept the stagger. Fine. But I gotta admit, I am a little bit disappointed then by the order of the release. The PHB and the Monster Manual being released 5 months apart feels like a big whiff. This allows for a significant amount of time where players will be using the new Player's Handbook with old monsters, so they may still not have a full picture of what their characters are actually capable of, as it's the monsters that contextualize the power of a given character. I would much rather have seen it be swapped with the DMG and had that come out in 2025, which actually would have also been consistent with the same order that the books were released in 2014 for 5th edition. Anyway, I'm not here to naysay, I want to stay positive. I have to hope that given the extended time that they're allowing for themselves for the updated Monster Manual, that we'll be able to see some meaningful changes and improvements to the book. And that's exactly what I wanted to discuss in this video. I want to take a look at the current state of the Monster Manual, and in particular the monster stat blocks, and give some of my predictions, my hopes and dreams for what we can actually see changed in the 2024-2025 version of the book. Hey, as of right now, less than a third of the people who watch my channel are actually subscribed, so if you enjoy what I do and would like to support me, I would really appreciate your subscription. I also want to give a huge shout out to all of my members as usual: Julian in the Champion tier, Jackal3 and Jumpy Sonic Bear in the Hero tier, and Julio, Siren XY, and Brain Laborks in the Warrior tier. Your help means so much to me. So if you'd also like to support me and get some awesome perks like early access to new videos, priority comment replies, and so much more, click on the join button. Thanks. Oh, and check out my Discord server, the link's in the description. A few really important caveats to state is that while we still don't know very much about what's going to appear in the new Monster Manual, there are a few things that we do know, so there's no point in discussing changes to things that we already know aren't going to be changing. Probably the most significant one is challenge rating. This has been a problem and a complaint within the community for the last decade, and it doesn't really appear that the system is going to be getting any kind of overhaul. In a video released in April of 2023, Chris Perkins confirmed that the challenge rating of all monsters currently in the 2014 Monster Manual will not be changing, but rather that adjustments will be made to the creature to allow them to more accurately hit their CR. This does mean that some of the absolutely busted monsters I listed in my Deadliest Creatures videos are going to be getting some significant changes to keep them in line, at least hopefully. While I think the really murky calculations of the challenge rating system could certainly use an update, I will at least be somewhat satisfied if CR can be reliably used by a DM as an indicator of actual challenge, which is often not the case right now. We also know that all creatures in the 2014 Monster Manual will be carried forward, with some new additions to fill in the gaps, particularly in the higher CR ranges, where there is a distinct lack of creatures. With all that being said, we're going to be specifically looking at monster design to shine a light on some of the things that can be improved to help the overall experience of both running and fighting against these creatures. While some of these things I'm going to suggest are more work than the others, I do believe that all of them are well within the realm of possibility for the revised book, whereas a full reimagining of creatures I believe goes well beyond the scope of a new Monster Manual. Also, I do know that monster design goes well beyond just combat, but I will be keeping this video largely framed within that context to help keep things a little bit more focused. We're going to start with the big one, which I expect to happen, and that's the removal of resistance to bludgeoning, piercing, and slashing damage from non-magical attacks, which I'll just refer to as non-magical BPS damage from now on. In its current state, 5th edition has created a world where having magical weapons is more or less mandatory if you're a character that uses weapons. This will typically disproportionately affect martial characters, as even though spellcasters can obviously use some weapons, it's the martial characters that are going to be using them the vast majority of the time, and are the ones that are truly feeling the impact of the resistance to non-magical BPS damage. Out of sheer curiosity, I did a really rough check on D&D Beyond, and it turns out that out of the 2,753 creatures listed, that 646 of them have immunity or resistance to non-magical BPS damage. That's nearly 25%. That's a lot. The count doesn't filter out the legacy creatures, so there are some duplicates, but the point still remains that it's a ridiculously high number of creatures that have this resistance or immunity, and as mentioned earlier, it creates a scenario where having some way of overcoming it is more or less mandatory if you want your weapon-wielding character to be effective in any meaningful way. The good news is that I am confident, or at least hopeful, that this poor element of monster design will be going away. In the playtest, it seems like every feature that granted magical attacks for the purposes of overcoming resistance and immunities has been changed or reworded in some way. The Circle of the Moon Druid's Primal Strike feature, which used to make your attacks while in wild shape be considered magical, has been replaced with the improved Circle's form, which, among other things, lets you decide whether your wild shape attacks will deal radiant damage or its normal damage type. The Monk's old 6th level feature, Key Empowered Strikes, which offered the same boon, now allows for the attacks to deal either force damage or the normal damage type. The Warlock's Pact of the Blade now lets you decide if it deals Necrotic Psychic Radiant or its normal damage type. Even the Heavy Armor Master feature has been adjusted. The 2014 version of the feature reduced non-magical BPS damage by 3, whereas the new version reduces BPS damage, magical or otherwise, by an amount equal to your proficiency bonus. What all this amounts to is the high likelihood that the design team is, hopefully at least, going to be removing this design element entirely, given that from everything we have seen at least, that verbiage has completely disappeared. I would really love for this to be the case, if for no other reason than it's just always been such an awkward phrase to parse. Especially when they throw in things like you have resistance to bludgeoning, piercing, and slashing damage from non-magical attacks that aren't silvered, sometimes on Tuesdays. It's a mouthful, and the first few times that you read it, there's no way you're not staring at this for a good minute just trying to understand it. It's wordy, it disproportionately affects one group over another, and doesn't really add anything interesting to the game. You either have a magical weapon or you don't. There's not really any nuance to it. The next thing that I'd like to see updated in a revised monster manual are some movement speeds, particularly Burrow. If you saw my 180 one-shot, you probably already know where this is heading. Burrow, in its current form, has the potential to be really interesting, but is a fairly easily abusable mechanic, sometimes even by accident. You can create a scenario where you effectively need to play whack-a-mole against the party, with you being able to pop up, attack, and burrow again, leaving no trail behind you. This is because, generally speaking, burrow creatures do not leave a tunnel behind them. The bizarre thing about this is that it's not actually explicitly stated that burrowing creatures don't leave tunnels, but it's rather implied by the existence of the tunneler trait, which can be found on some creatures like the purple worm, and was then subsequently reinforced by an answer in the Sage Advice Compendium. Firstly, burrow. The exact wording is, a monster that has a burrowing speed can use that speed to move through sand, earth, mud, or ice. A monster can't burrow through solid rock unless it has a special trait that allows it to do so. This, as you might notice, says nothing of tunnels, but as you can probably assume that most burrows through mud or sand wouldn't leave a tunnel, but rather just fill in behind the creature unless the sand is wet. Now you get into the weird physics territory which D&D tends to try and steer away from, which is honestly fine for the sake of the game. But then ice or earth? I feel like there's a strong argument to be made here that those could easily leave a tunnel behind them. Either way, the purple worm has the tunneler trait, which reads, the worm can burrow through solid rock at half its burrow speed and leaves a 10-foot diameter tunnel in its wake. This then suggests that the only way to leave a tunnel is to have the tunneler trait. But what if you didn't actually know that the worm exists? You end up in this murky situation where everyone is guessing, and you'll probably have different rulings at different times with no real consistency. It's also probably worth noting that the tunneler trait only works on things like solid rock, and it doesn't also leave a tunnel through sand, and this isn't explicitly stated either. Finally, this question was actually indirectly answered in Sage Advice, where a question asked, can a creature that burrows grapple a target and drag them into the ground by burrowing? To which the answer was, no. A burrowing creature can drag another creature with them only if they have the ability to leave a tunnel. For example, a purple worm has the tunneler trait, so it can drag a grappled creature into a tunnel it creates when burrowing. Conversely, an earth elemental can't drag a creature into the ground with it. This pretty definitively answers the question that burrow, on its own, and at least as written, does not leave a tunnel regardless of the substance that the creature is burrowing through. So if that seemed like an unnecessarily complicated way of arriving at the answer, no, then you're right. People also shouldn't need to know the intricacies of specific monster traits or refer to sage advice to have an understanding of what basic mechanics exist in the game. The definition of burrow in the monster manual should be updated to reflect that creatures with a burrow speed do not leave a tunnel unless their stat block says otherwise and defines the material. This only addresses the first half of the whole whack-a-mole problem thing though. Obviously, if the creature left the tunnel, you could just go chase after it, but if it doesn't, well, then nothing has really been addressed, but at least the definition is now clear. The first thing that jumps to mind would be something along the lines of preventing the burrowing creature from burrowing again the same turn that it pops up on. This still has the benefit of allowing the feature to be used defensively, but makes it far less of an offensive tactic. Sure, every second round you are still potentially whack-a-moling, but the creature is less likely to pop up in a more centralized or dangerous or advantageous location since they know they can't just run away immediately. The logic here being that burrowing isn't as easy as just moving. You're contending with the substance that you're trying to move through. Maybe something like this wouldn't apply to a creature with Earth Glide like the Earth Elemental, since that's nearly akin to walking. Like I said though, this is just my first thought and I'd love to hear your ideas in the comments. Since we're talking about movement, I also want to quickly address hover. As far as I can tell, this trait is never actually explicitly defined in any of the 3 books, but it really should have a paragraph in the new monster manual. The closest definition that it gets is in the combat section of the player's handbook under the section flying movement, where it states, flying creatures enjoy many benefits of mobility, but they must also deal with the danger of falling. If a flying creature is knocked prone, has its speed reduced to 0, or is otherwise deprived of the ability to move, the creature falls unless it has the ability to hover or it is being held aloft by magic, such as by the fly spell. Otherwise, in the monster manual, it only gets barely a nod in the flying section and essentially just tells you to refer to the PHP. It's not exactly user-friendly. Anyway, I'm sure that I'm not alone in that when I first saw hover, I kind of assumed that it just worked similarly to how the levitate spell works, effectively letting you just kind of fly up into a cap. But it's not that at all. It's basically just fly plus. It makes it so that you can fly as normal, but if something knocks you down, you don't actually hit the ground, but instead you just stay aloft. If I had my preference, I would like to see it work similarly to levitate. I think it would also be a little bit more intuitive. In any case though, I don't really expect that to change, so at least there should be a section properly defining it in the new book. Next, I'd like to see a little bit more clarity for when it's possible for a spell or a spell-like effect to be countered or interacted with in some way. See, when Monsters of the Multiverse was released back in January 2022, there were a lot of changes made to monster stat blocks, many of which dealt with magic and spells. Spell lists were officially removed and replaced with a per-day mechanic for spells, a change that I actually really like, but I know that not everyone does. Anyway, many creatures were also given spell attacks under their action section. These, despite what the description suggests, are not spells. They cannot be countered. Creatures like the Aeorian Nullifier from Explorer's Guide to Wildmount has Counterspell as a reaction, but Counterspell is also listed in its spells as at will. So is the reaction just using the spell, or is it using a magic-like effect? It's all really unclear and vague, and especially so if you're relatively new to the game. I really do applaud the effort with Monsters of the Multiverse to make creatures try and feel a little bit more powerful. It improved the action economy in many ways for a lot of monsters and prevented many of their magic-like effects from being able to be countered, but it provided exactly 0 guidance on how to actually run or use these things. I don't think it would be unreasonable for a new player to think that something tagged as a spell attack could be countered, especially when that exact same verbiage, spell attack, is found countless times in actual spells that can be countered. And yes, I am aware that magic-like effects have been around since well before Monsters of the Multiverse, like the Mind Flayer's Mind Blast feature, but the book really went hard on making more and embrace these magic abilities that aren't spells in a fundamentally different way. Even if the stat blocks aren't changed, some detailed guidance on these stat blocks and all the intricacies of them would really be helpful. On the topic of running monsters and interpreting stat blocks, I would love to see tags or categorization for monsters. Not to limit what they can actually do or to have any interaction with the rules at all, but just to function as a guideline for DMs when building encounters. I know this has existed in previous editions, and MCDM's book Flee Mortals did a great job with these too. The idea is that every creature is effectively assigned what amounts to a role. Flee Mortals uses things like artillery, brute, skirmisher, solo, support, controller, leader, and so many more to really give the dungeon master an idea of how a creature should be run in combat or to use when building an encounter. When designing an encounter, you often know the type of scenario or the creature mix that you're looking for, but it can be difficult to look through the thousands of creatures to find exactly what you want. Adding tags like this to creatures to quickly aid the encounter building process would be a wonderful addition for a DM that could really streamline this process. While this is certainly not the last update that I would like to see to the new monster manual, the last one that I'm going to talk about is vulnerabilities and damage interactions. I think that vulnerabilities are a largely underexplored aspect of monster design, and it's kind of a shame. Now, to be clear, I do kind of understand why. It can be really easy to completely undermine a monster's difficulty through exploitation of knowledge of monster vulnerabilities, which can be an element of metagaming that might even be unavoidable to a large extent. The thing is though, what this results in is that damage type choice is effectively irrelevant in a lot of cases. Most people just do the damage type that they normally do without too much thought, or at the very least, the damage type that the creature isn't resistant or immune to. To me, that isn't particularly interesting or dynamic, but it's just so close. Adding more vulnerabilities can reward players for accessing different damage types on weapons and choosing varieties of spells. But to be clear, I'm not saying that they should just add tons of vulnerabilities blanket across the board, though it would be a start. Using damage vulnerabilities and adding interesting damage type interactions would really go a long way to making encounters way more interesting. For example, the Troll's regeneration feature doesn't work if it took acid or fire damage on the previous turn. This is probably one of the most basic examples of this type of interaction that a lot of people don't really think about all that much. A Flesh Golem's aversion to fire trait makes it so that if it takes fire damage, it has disadvantage on attack rolls and ability checks until the end of its next turn. Again, this is a really intriguing interaction and one that has an immediate and dynamic impact on the encounter, but it also allows players and characters to learn and be more engaged throughout the encounter. Maybe you even make a suboptimal attack that happens to deal fire damage so the rest of your party can benefit from that. I think the best example of this design though is the Frost Salamander from Monsters of the Multiverse, as it combines both a vulnerability and a type interaction. The Frost Salamander has a recharge ability called Freezing Breath, which deals 8d10 cold damage to creatures in a 60-foot cone on a failed DC 17 Constitution saving throw. However, it also has vulnerability to fire damage. But when the Frost Salamander is subjected to fire damage, its Burning Fury trait makes it so that its Freezing Breath attack automatically recharges. This allows a decision to be made between being able to deal double damage, but also potentially suffering from a much stronger area of effect attack. Things like this can even inform your party's positioning and how they approach combat in a much more interesting and unique way. While I think that if done excessively, it can get a bit stale and make things almost too predictable, I really do feel like this should be a design space that can be explored a lot more. There's so much more that I can get into on this topic, but I also don't want this video to be like an hour long. Things like redesigning legendary resistance, guidance for dynamically scaling monsters to be weaker or stronger, looking at status conditions, and just so much more. Let me know your thoughts in the comments, and maybe I'll even make a part 2 for this. At the end of the day, basically everything I've talked about here is all about making creatures and combat encounters feel much more interesting, dynamic, and fun. Creatures shouldn't just be giant bags of hit points. They should feel different, and I think things even as simple as tagging monsters where they might be best suited in an encounter can really help DMs plan more thoughtful and engaging combats. Thanks so much for taking the time to watch this video. Consider subscribing to help support me and check out some of my other D&D videos. But otherwise, take care.